Hey everybody, it's Mr. McCaver here, and today we're going to talk about Central and Eastern Europe. And as this conversation starts, we really want to be focusing on three different civilizations during this period. The Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians. So the Ushas are our focus today. But before we get to the individual different societies and groups, we need to just lay some basic groundwork for what's different in Central and Eastern Europe than what's happening in Western Europe. Eastern Europe is not Western Europe. Well, that seems like, well, duh, whatever. There are some significant societal differences when it comes to Eastern Europe compared to Western Europe. Eastern Europe is exclusively farmers, for all intents and purposes. There are very, very few cities in this area of the world. You have a Vienna in Austria. We'll have a Moscow in Russia. And eventually the creation of a Berlin in Prussia, but at this point in time, we're talking very minimal on any sort of urban life at all on this portion of the continent. We don't have the large metropolitan areas that you have in Paris, that you have in Barcelona, that you have in Madrid, that you have in London. Those aren't there. Amsterdam, not a thing. We don't have that type of civilization here. They don't have industry. They have much weaker governments that are really designed around compromise and deals, as opposed to the autocratic power of people like Louis XIV, like a Charles V in Spain. These guys who had total control, well, it's not how things are going to be in Eastern Europe, at least in the beginning. There's going to be a push towards that later on. And then also, they are still dealing with the wars that took place, the wars of religion, as a result of the Protestant Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire was crippled during that period. Austria is going to be dealing with this. These areas are still struggling to rebuild from the 30 Years' War, from the various wars of religion. So they're really behind the curve in comparison to their Western European counterparts. So let's talk about how all of this is going to initially change by really pointing out the example of the one time it doesn't change. So we're going to look at our example, a quintessential example of the disaster, worst case scenario of a European nation. And that's going to be Poland. This is sadly really one of the only times we're ever going to talk about Poland, because Poland just never gets going. They have a unique tradition in their society that there is no natural born king or monarch or anything. The leader of Poland is actually selected by election of the nobles, and most of the time the nobles can never actually agree on anyone, so they never have a king, which means their government is kind of left without leadership. They do have a representative government, elected a legislator, called the Shim. I can't pronounce that correctly. I apologize. And they will have one significant standout king during the course of their history, a guy by the name of John Sobieski. But that's it. There's nothing else. Because of that, Poland's just going to be absorbed by various groups over the course of the next 200 years. Whether it's the Prussians, whether it's the Austrians, whether it's the Russians, they will all just suck up Poland, and it won't reappear on a map until the 1900s. And even then, that's just a brief blip in time, because they appear at the end of World War I, and they disappear at the beginning of World War II. For like 15 years, they exist. That's just life for Poland during this period, and it's a good example of what life is like in Eastern Europe. It's hard. It is trying. But there are civilizations that do have a better track record and better success record than Poland does. And the first one of those that we're going to talk about is going to be Austria. Alright, so remember first, before we get into the whole details of Austria, this is a territory, this is an empire controlled by the Habsburgs. This was one half of the empire that Charles V had. This is the portion that he gave to his brother and said, rule this. It's Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, all bundled together. It was given to his brother. Well, we're going to focus largely on the Austria portion of it today, because right now, the Holy Roman Empire is a mess. The 30 Years' War utterly destroyed it. And because of that, the Austrian monarchs during this period are really going to be focusing on the Austria portion, because there's enough problems within that empire, enough challenges that they have to deal with, that they feel that their efforts are better served focusing on that portion as opposed to a really crippled and kind of useless Holy Roman Empire during this time. So, whereas a lot of the areas in Western Europe are developing situations where one society, uniform in religion, uniform in culture is created, like in France and England. In Austria, that's not really the case. They are just a hodgepodge of a variety of different cultures, and the list of cultures that is absorbed into the Austrian Empire grows during this period. Because Austrian invasions, Austrian military exploits will add two significant pieces of land to their empire. First, they will take what was left of the Netherlands that used to be controlled by Spain. After the 30 Years' War, the northern portion of the Netherlands became an independent country. The southern portion of the Netherlands was controlled by Spain. Well, Austria is going to take that territory from Spain. Second, they will also move into northern Italy and conquer a portion of northern Italy called Lombardy. Lombardy is the northeastern portion of Italy. And what this does is it provides some access to the Mediterranean for the Austrian Empire, which is going to be a focus for them during the next 50 to 100 years of Austrian rule. But all of this is happening in a different manner than what's happening in France and England. Whereas Louis XIV, whereas the people in Spain, whereas other people were trying to take away power from nobility, Austria is working with their nobility. Because they have such a diverse set of cultures within the empire, because the Czechs are different than the Romanians are different than the Hungarians are different than the Austrians, who are different than the Transylvanians, who are different than the Croatians, and I can keep going for 20 minutes on this. They realize the best situation for them is to work together as opposed to try to create a unified people. That would lead to utter disaster. Is pretty much every time we talked about this up to this point, it's led to disaster, and every time we talk to it later, it will also lead to disaster. People want difference. They want their individuality. They want their own respective beliefs. So Austrian kings will work with princes of various cultures, and they make agreements and compromises, and they will do those things needed to create peace within this very diverse empire. And they do this all the while consistently facing threats from the Turks to the east, and oftentimes from the French as well to the west. So it's a really tough situation to be in. And because of that, they are going to be really dependent on good leadership. Austria will only thrive when it has good leaders at the top. These leaders will work with princes. They will compromise with nobles. And they will create a situation where the empire as a whole can move forward. And our first good example of this is a guy by the name of Leopold I. Throughout the reign of Leopold, he is pretty much consistently going to have to deal with the fact that the Ottomans are always trying to invade in the east, and the French are really poking and prodding in the west, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire. So because of this, he makes some strategic alliances with various princes within his empires and develops a modern, efficient military, at least as modern as Austria can get during this period. All the while not forgetting that it's also important for him to grow the economy and society of the empire as well. So when they take the area of Lombardy, he's going to invest a significant amount of effort in making Austria a Mediterranean trading power. He's trying to kind of work his way into the trading empire that the Italians and the Turks used to have. And this is really going to try to bring in a bunch of new money for Austria to pay for the consistent warfare issues that they have to deal with. And in it trying to avoid the debt problems that you see in places like France and England, who are incapable of paying for the consistent warfare that takes place during this European period. And Leopold kind of masters this pretty well. And things go well for Austria for a time. But Leopold's grandson is going to run into a problem. His grandson runs into the problem that he has no male heirs. And he's not going to play the Henry VIII wife roulette game of like, spin the wheel and see if a new wife can get me a male son. Instead, he thinks about this very pragmatically. I have daughters. They're capable. I need to set up a framework in which they can rule and rule successfully. So, he will get together the various princes of the Austrian Empire and the various monarchs of Europe and draft a document called the Pragmatic Sanction. It is a document that's supposed to have the various princes and the monarchs of Europe recognize the inheritance of his daughter Maria Theresa as the new Queen of Austria, and that even if Maria Theresa marries, she is the monarch of Austria, not someone else who marries into the family. So the Habsburg line stays intact. It is still led by the Habsburg family. This is clever. It's really important for him to lay this groundwork early on. Now, this isn't the first time we've had a woman ruler in Europe. I mean, we've already talked about Elizabeth before. We've seen Catherine de' Medici play an important role in France. We've seen Isabella in Spain. We've seen Mary Tudor in England. Women have had control of European countries. Eastern Europe is a little bit different. He realized that. He didn't want the various princes trying to attack his daughter the moment he died and overthrow the monarchy, so he lays this groundwork. And it's good. It's a good idea. Successful-ish, to a degree.
Yay!
Everyone's happy. For a time. Because there always has to be a problem at some point. He makes all these preparations for his daughter's rise to power, but unlike Leopold, who had created this strong, impressive military, his grandson forgot to really ever create one for his daughter. It's like, hey, I laid all this legal groundwork for you. You're going to become queen. You're going to rule the country. It's great. But then leaves her with no actual ability to keep this country intact if someone were to invade. So Maria is going to become the new Queen of Austria, and she's immediately going to have to deal with threats from everywhere else. Problems always find a way of happening, and they will come in the form of a country called Prussia. So, 30 Years' War ended. We're going to kind of rewind, lay out a new piece of groundwork for us here. 30 Years' War ended. Austria is now focusing on itself. France is doing its own thing with Louis XIV. What we see is one of the German states really rise to prominence in the Holy Roman Empire, and it's going to be a land called Prussia. It's in northern, kind of eastern Germany, and it's going to be built around a family who is going to play a major role in European affairs. They're called the Hohenzollerns. They are based out of the area called Brandenburg, which is right around what we would call Berlin today, and the area surrounding it. And they have been the prince of that area since the 1400s. So they've been established. They've been there for a few hundred years. And they've been kind of waiting their opportunity to see them really rise to prominence in the area. And after the 30 Years' War, when the Habsburgs really focus on Austria, the French are focusing on the French, and everyone else is kind of doing their own thing and building their stable nations, the Hohenzollerns pounce. And they're going to become the dominant group in the Holy Roman Empire. Well, where does this begin? Well, it begins with Frederick William the Great Elector. If you remember, we once talked about a guy earlier called Frederick the Great Elector. This is the leader of the various electors who choose the Holy Roman Emperor. Where Frederick William is going to spend a lot of time focusing on the area that he directly controls, and not as much the Holy Roman Empire as a whole. When he does this, he creates a very strong central government in Prussia, and actively undermines the nobility to do it. He will take every tactic in the book, Machiavelli would be proud, in order to gain control of Prussia and the neighboring states to really strengthen Prussia. It doesn't matter if he has to use military force. It doesn't matter if he has to just tax people out into oblivion to raise money. And it doesn't matter if he has to strong-arm people to agree to things they don't want to agree to. He will make it happen. And it works. But unfortunately, a few eggs had to be broken along the way. The peasantry of Prussia is really going to suffer during this period because he needs money to make all these campaigns, this civilization that he is trying to mold in this Prussian mindset work. And that's not going to be great later on. But all of this work will eventually lay the groundwork so that Frederick William's son will become the new king of Prussia, and he will be known as Frederick the First. And this is important because we're going to have some just ridiculous name jumble here. So, Frederick William the Great Elector becomes king, or at least is the leader of Prussia. His son, Frederick the First, becomes the king of Prussia. Let's keep going. Frederick the First dies, and his son, Frederick William, becomes one of the greatest leaders in Prussian history. So we have Frederick William, Great Elector, Frederick the First, Frederick William the First. He is going to really try to differentiate Prussia from Austria, and that becomes his dominant goal. I want to make Prussia unique. I'm going to make Prussia different. I don't want to be ruled by Austrian forces in any way, shape, and form. And in order to do this, he is going to create the strongest army in Europe. He will build Prussian life, Prussian society around the existence of the military. Life is centered around it, military exploits. He creates new legal codes for military officers. He makes actual incentives to become a military officer. He actually encourages people, creates a situation where people have to choose if they want to or not, and people actively want to go because of all the new laws and all the benefits that he creates to become a soldier. And due to all of his efforts to create this army, the size of the Prussian army will go from 13,000 people to 80,000. That's over a 600% increase in the course of 30 years. His famous quote is, "Where some nations have armies, Prussia has its state." Really what he's trying to say here is that countries may have an army, but Prussia's army is everything. Our nation is an army. We are a mobilized country ready to fight and win any war. So this is really setting Prussia up for some significant movement up the ranks of significant powers in Europe. Unfortunately, this very militaristic mentality is going to have an impact on his ability to be a good dad. And he's a pretty crappy dad to his son, Frederick II, who will tell some other stories about it at different times, but we'll say it this way, he kind of views his son as a soldier more than he views his son as a son. So when he grows up as a kid, he's going to make his son do live through some pretty rough experiences. We'll just leave it at that. So let's talk about the son. Tough love. Gotta love it. Frederick II will be known as Frederick the Great, one of the greatest monarchs of this entire period of European history. Despite his tough upbringing from his dad, he is going to be an effective ruler. In fact, he will actually view himself as the father of his people. Because of that, he will treat them appropriately, but at the same time doesn't mean he's also afraid to act as a ruler and afraid to act as a monarch who's willing to invade. And he will do that. And this is where we get back to the whole situation of Maria Theresa in Austria. Because with the rise of Frederick II as the new monarch in Prussia, one of the first things he does as king is invades Austria. And that's the story where we'll leave it there. Last up on our agenda list is Russia. Russia is the odd man out in Europe at this point in time. We haven't really talked about them at all. So we need to bring up a lot here. But we'll do it pretty quickly. Alright, so this is a story of Ivan IV. His nickname is Ivan the Terrible. He is one of the more feared and not loved rulers in European history. But there's a lot of story to this. We're going to skip the videos, blah, 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 blah. If you want to watch them, watch the class notes that exist on the server. So Ivan is going to become the first Tsar of Russia. What that means is he's the first leader of a unified Russia. During his time, it's not easy. It's not great. He gains control of all of Russia through some pretty horrific means. Secret police forces, torture, mass executions, destroys his own city just because he got frustrated and pissed off, killed his own son. Like, all of these things are not great. There's a reason why his name is Ivan the Terrible. But he lays the groundwork for a strong, centralized Russian government. And it's an impressive one, because the Russian dynasty that he begins, the Romanov dynasty, will last until the 20th century. Almost 400 years of influence. The dynasty officially begins with the man who replaces Ivan, since Ivan killed his own son, a guy by the name of Michael Romanov. This will end what they call the Time of Troubles in Russian history, which is effectively the rule of Ivan IV because of all the violence and everything else. He is the grandnephew of Ivan's wife, Anastasia, and really that's all we need to know about him. But he begins a significant dynastic line that's going to play a major role in European history from this point on until the Russian Revolution in 1918. And that is real impressive. Because pretty much every European monarchy, European dynasty is going to switch over at some point in time, except for, well, I guess except for the Eastern Europeans, because Russia, Austria, and Prussia all persist until the 20th century. But this is really trying to drag Russia back into the game. And it's setting the stage for probably the greatest ruler in Russian history, when we don't take into account the really evil Soviet Union ones. It's setting the stage for the rise of Peter the Great. Peter is going to radically reshape Russia in ways that no one could even imagine back during this period. He's going to make Russia into a global powerhouse. An empire that matches really just the ridiculous size of Peter himself. And at that point where we end our story for today. Thanks and have a great day.